Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this panel discussion on criminalizing Islam, the Western European panel discussion. So why are MPACUK UK doing this event, Criminalizing Islam? The simplest and bluntest answer to this question is that we see normative Islamic practices being used as markers for extremism. What does that mean in plain English? It means that, for example, if a child expresses an Islamic opinion in school, he may be interviewed by police. It means that so-called counter-violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, CVE or PVE for short, these policies single out Muslims when they are applied on a national level. This event is the Western Europe panel and will be the first of a series, inshallah, as we track the spread of counter-violent extremism legislation and its subsequent impact on Muslims around the world. Case in point would be the UN Security Council Resolution 2178, which bound nations to CVE and PVE policies. As a community, we need to realize that we must be alert to the spread of these policies in other countries because they will end up on our own doorstep too. But we as Muslims should take heart too. If we can defeat such legislation in our own countries, not only have we stopped it here, but we can help and train other Muslims to tackle it elsewhere too. The saga begins in the Netherlands thanks to two key documents: Recruitment for the Jihad in the Netherlands, From Recruitment to Trends, and a memo titled Counter-Terrorism in the Netherlands. So we will start our discussion there. Before we start, we have some simple ground rules. The chat function is for any questions, which will be answered in the Q&A at the end, inshallah. The chat is not for provoking or responding to provocation. Anyone who breaks this simple rule will be removed. Questions from our Zoom audience will be prioritized. And if there's time, we will come to questions from our Facebook audience. To join in on Zoom at our next event, book a ticket on Eventbrite and look out for updates on our social media. And lastly, if you want to see more of these kinds of events, join our team as a volunteer. There will be links in the chat. We have Dr. Layla Aitlhadj based in the UK. She is a director of several not-for-profit organizations that support people impacted by injustice, including Prevent Watch and Nomos. And she is also co-chair of the People's Review of Prevent. She has also been published in Islam 21C, Ceasefire Magazine, and MiddleEast Eye. It gives me great pleasure to host her in today's event. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for having me on today. I'm going to give a very brief background on Prevent in the UK context, and then focus in on some case studies, because at Prevent Watch, what we do is we support people who have been impacted by Prevent. And to date, we've supported nearly 600 individuals. And so we have quite a rich resource of case studies that we can draw upon when we're talking about the criminalization of Muslims via Prevent. So just to understand, Prevent in the UK is one of the first and most well-developed forms of counter-extremism around the world. I guess every country in the world now has a counter-extremism strategy of some form, but the UK was one of the first and most well-developed. I know that the Dutch beat us to it, but the UK has definitely developed it apace and ensured that they've really deeply embedded it across all sectors. And Prevent is only one arm of what we already have in the counterterrorism strategy, where we have three other arms. So we have Pursue, Protect, and Prepare. But Prevent sits very uniquely in this pre-criminal space. So you are fully thinking not about pre-crime, as the word sometimes suggests, and some people think, oh, pre-crime, that's good because you get the person before they commit the crime. But it's not. Like, the pre-crime space is actually a point in time well before somebody has even had the intention to commit a crime. We're talking about 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds who might do something today that, according to the logic of Prevent and pre-crime, would suggest that they might be vulnerable to radicalization or extremism or terrorism in the future. So, of course, this particular logic has never been evidenced. There's no evidence to suggest that you can do this, that you can predict in that manner any crime, let alone a terrorist act. And what the UK approach really did very early on was it took away the focus from the idea of radicalizers and trying to stop the radicalizers and concentrating on the people who are vulnerable to the radicalizers. So it's almost like if you're looking at a situation of grooming, which often, extremism is likened by the Prevent lobby to grooming, it would be like taking your focus away from the groomers and looking at the victims of grooming. So that's essentially where UK Prevent kind of has its focus on. And I believe up until about 2014, then Europe, the rest of Europe started to look at it with this lens. So it was looking away from the so-called like soon-to-be perpetrators and was looking at the people who might be impacted by those radicalizers. So with Prevent in the UK, it is now, although it started in 2003 as a policy, since 2015, it has been a legal duty upon all public sector workers to have a due regard to stop people from being drawn into terrorism. So that is all of your teachers, all of your doctors, anyone who basically works in the public sector has a legal mandate to report people who show what they have been trained to think of as signs of vulnerability to radicalization. And essentially there has been a huge number of organizations and individuals and across civil society who have raised concerns about Prevent and about the harms of Prevent. And one of those harms or one of those concerns is its Islamophobic nature. And we have seen evidence of that in cases, and we're not the only people who have seen this. We know many other reports and research have been published around this. There is a solid evidence base showing that Prevent is Islamophobic, including the Home Office's statistics in and of themselves show quite clearly that Prevent disproportionately targets Muslims. It always has. And even though over the years and given the evolution of Prevent, they say now, they target all forms of extremism and include far-right extremism, actually, you're still disproportionately impacting Muslims. Given the percentage of Muslims in the UK is only 5%, Muslims are still several times more likely, even today in 2022, to be referred to Prevent. So I'll give a few examples of the cases that we've had. So there was a sister who started to wear hijab, and she actually had a very good job in healthcare, in the healthcare sector. And once she started to wear the hijab, she went away on annual leave, she came back, and when she came back, her colleagues started to ask her a lot of questions about her religion, which I guess when you first start wearing hijab is kind of normal because I guess people don't see you as like externally being Muslim. And then once you start wearing hijab, they're a bit more interested, like, oh, tell me a bit more. So they started asking her questions about her religion. And then that developed into asking her questions about her Facebook posts, a bit more about her social media, about, what she thought about the attacks in Tunisia at that time. The sniper attack in Tunisia had occurred. So they were asking her about her opinion on that. And it developed more and more gradually to ask about all her views in all different ways that she couldn't quite understand. And eventually it led to her being referred to Prevent by some of her colleagues. And so she ended up going into a meeting, speaking to her senior, managers who were saying to her, your colleagues essentially have concerns about you, that you're essentially what they're saying is you are a future terrorist, right? We fear that you may be a future terrorist. So you can imagine, if you went into work and your colleagues essentially referred you to a program because they thought that you were a potential terrorist, going to be a potential terrorist in the future, how that would impact your relationships at work. And she did eventually end up leaving that role because of the stress that caused. And nothing came of it, essentially, in that, there were no concerns to follow through with, and the Prevent officers eventually just closed the case. But this did cause a lot of distress for her, and she did end up leaving her place of work as a result. We also have another sister who converted to Islam, and shortly after, not too shortly after, it was a few years after her conversion to Islam, she wanted to get married, and she met a fellow Muslim man online. And given the age that we're at now, a lot of people meet people online. So especially in the UK, and in other Western countries. I think this has been going on for a long time, so it's nothing abnormal, but this was flagged as abnormal because of the fact that she'd met this Muslim man online, and she wasn't just chatting away with him or deciding to go on holiday, but she actually wanted to marry him. And this raised a concern, and she was referred to Prevent. And of course, this caused a whole host of issues with her family, who were the originators of the Prevent referral, because of course they were concerned because they're not from Muslim background. They couldn't quite understand why you would meet this Muslim man online and then you want to marry him, like you've not met him. And then, of course, this caused a whole host of issues once the Prevent officers tried to question her, essentially, and find out a bit more. I can't really go into too much detail about that one because there is a legal case around it. And then there are other signs of increased religiosity that we've seen in other cases. So, for example, there was a teacher who was praying in congregation with some of his students. They were older students, they're in the sixth form, so that makes them about 17 years, 18 years old. And they wanted to pray in congregation. And so he was leading the prayers as a fellow Muslim man in the building. And he was questioned about that. And he was then referred by his employers to Prevent. He was contacted actually during the COVID lockdown, during the first lockdown that we had. He was doorstepped by Prevent officers who were asking him about his views, why was he praying in congregation, and just asking generally why he would have been referred to Prevent. And again, that led to him leaving that job, leaving that role. And then the last example I'll give is of a 17-year-old student who requested some time off. It actually fell within the half term in a way. So he had some time off, and then he just requested a small extension of time off so that he could go to Umrah. And he was referred to Prevent. The Prevent officer essentially came in and asked him, even though the school had approved his time off, they came in and asked him all sorts of questions about who he had been with in Umrah and why he decided to go. And when he challenged them, they essentially said, oh, no, we're just making sure that you're going with a reputable company because there's a lot of companies that rip people off during Umrah. It's like, since when did Prevent officers become, the regulators of the travel and tourism industry to check up and just make sure that I'm doing okay and I'm not being scammed by my trip to Umrah, which I've already completed. I've gone and come back with no complaints. So it's just really stupid responses when they find even children challenging them on the basis upon which they're asking them questions. So I guess essentially you might think, okay, well, that's not too bad. You get questioned by Prevent officers. There's no real harm in that, rather be safe than sorry. But this is occurring up and down the country every year in the thousands, at least of what we know. And we know there are many cases that haven't been logged under official statistics. And one of those quite famously came out last year, which was the Fortnite case. And it was a young Muslim boy who had been referred to Prevent because he was talking about the game Fortnite. And of course he was saying, I was in my shed playing with guns and bombs. And instead of looking at that and saying the child's 4 or 5, of course he wasn't playing with guns and bombs. The assumption was, of course he was playing with guns and bombs. Let's call the police. And so the police turn up at his door at 10:30 in the night to check out this shed where this young child is playing with guns and bombs. Now, when we publicized that case, the pro-Prevent lobby came out and said, no, this isn't one of our cases. We checked, this case doesn't exist. So that we always knew that there were more cases that weren't officially recorded in the statistics, depending on where they got to in the pipeline of the Prevent referral. And this just reinforced for us the fact that that case didn't make the official statistics. How many other cases haven't made the official statistics? And what therefore is the scale of Prevent referrals when we're looking at them in the UK? Because the official statistics show about 6,000-7,000 a year, but how many thousands are going without being logged? And this is a really important question to think about, especially in the UK, where you have 5 million public sector workers. All of those are legally mandated to report people for signs of radicalization. And private sector companies are also taking this on as well and training their staff, even though they're not mandated and not required to do so. They are taking this on. So you have McDonald's, Boots, and other companies who don't need to do this, who are training their staff up in Prevent. So yeah, essentially, I guess when it comes to the impact, what this really means, yes, we've seen people leave their jobs because it's become very uncomfortable for them. Yes, we've seen people get quite ill because of the levels of stress that this causes. But there are some real kind of more tangible harms that we see as well in terms of, you know, the majority of Prevent referrals in the UK, more than half, are children. And when children get referred to Prevent, more often than not, the children's services becomes involved. So the family can have absolutely no history with social services, children's services, but because now your child has been referred to Prevent, you will have a social worker knocking at your door asking to assess your family. And of course, the social worker has been seeded with this idea that your child is at risk of radicalization. And therefore, everything they see in your home, from, you know, the extensive, like, beautiful collection of hadiths that you thought was beautiful, is absolutely terrifying to them. They've just walked into your house and your entire wall has books with Arabic text. Like, so all of these things become, and we've seen it in many assessments where they say, yeah, the young child started wearing hijab, and there were a lot of Islamic texts in the room. And yeah, taken by themselves, this isn't a concern, but taken together, all these random points together makes them quite worried, right? So you have involvement of social services. Now, social services can keep your information on their records for at least 25 years. At least 25 years. So imagine as a 5-year-old, you've been reported, social services have come, everything's fine, whatever, they've left you alone. You have a record with social services now that you never had before, your family never had before. So if your neighbor decides that they're gonna, you know, put in a malicious referral or anything like that, this all builds up. And we've seen this happen. We've seen people make referrals off the back of another referral. And like I said, the data tends to kind of add up in their minds. Also, what we see in terms of, because we're talking about data, is data retention on police databases. Now, Prevent officers are counterterrorism officers. They're not even your bog standard police officer. They are counterterrorism officers. And they have essentially taken your details as part of a Prevent referral, and it is being stored on databases alongside criminals. Even though you've not been charged or even suspected of committing a crime, your data is now stored alongside all the other data. Even if you're a child, even if you're a 5-year-old child, your data could be stored along there, and there is no distinction between your data as a child, non-criminal, and an adult convicted criminal. So that is quite a scary concept to think about. Yeah, so I guess apart from all of these things, as Brother Paris said earlier, you know, if it is hard to think of anything that has come through the courts, because this isn't a crime, right? There's no crime committed. But what that also means for people who have been impacted by Prevent is it's hard to challenge what has happened to them, right? Because it all occurs outside of the legal space. So it's very hard to challenge and say, oh, this has happened to me and it's discriminatory, because they're saying, no, it wasn't discriminatory. We would have referred anyone under Prevent under those circumstances. Or it's hard to then, you know, challenge various referrals or data retention. It has happened, and alhamdulillah, we have had some successes. So there were 2 very high profile ones where children's data was removed from the Metropolitan Police database and other police databases. So that was really successful. It had to go through the courts. But more recently, we've had at least 3 other clients who didn't have to go through the courts, who were able to challenge the retention of their data under Data Protection Act. And they were able to successfully remove it. So these are some of the small gains, but it's really bittersweet because you wonder why you have to put up such a fight and go through all that stress in order to do something that should have never happened in the first place, which is that children's information is sitting on databases with known and convicted criminals. So what does this mean in terms of UK and Prevent and CVE? I'll just quickly wrap up here, because essentially Prevent has been described as an industry. And I really think that, you know, if Prevent is an industry, then the UK certainly is an industry leader. it's the leader of this industry because it is in a unique position with regards to power and politics, being one of the founders of the UN, being part of the EU, RAN, Radical Awareness Network. And essentially, at the moment, what we have in the UK is we're just awaiting for a so-called independent review by the government to be conducted on Prevent. This is the second review that's happened in almost 20 years. And every time that Prevent has been reviewed or revised, essentially what we've seen is the strengthening of Prevent. We've not seen any of the genuine concerns and criticisms because the UK is essentially exporting Prevent up and down the countries. We see that in terms of the Prevent lobbyists who are, constantly on their Twitter taking snaps of being in different countries, talking about the great successes of Prevent. And of course, there is no evidence to show success of Prevent. And what they tend to do is to suggest that, the success of Prevent and the success of counter-extremism lies in these plots that they've unfoiled. And actually, it's really misleading because plots that have been unfoiled have nothing to do with Prevent. That's a completely different category of legislation that you're looking at, because this is a plot that has been foiled, and Prevent acts way before that time and space. And so I'll actually challenge a little bit the title as my leaving remark, the title of this event, which is, the criminalization of Muslims. And I would say that Prevent, especially in the UK context, and I'm sure around the world, as CVE, is worse than criminalizing Muslims, because at least if you are criminalized, first, you would have had the presumption of innocence. And secondly, you'd be able to fight it based on rights with some, equal measure. But with Prevent, you really can't do that.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Layla, for that, especially the final thought. We're going to have to reword the future series. But yeah, alhamdulillah, the work that Dr. Layla and Prevent Watch are doing, especially with the People's Review of Prevent coming up, inshallah, will become a useful toolkit that can be utilized by Muslims around the world, inshallah, who also have to bear the brunt of the UK being an industry leader of PVE and CVE. I'm going to now swap forward to our next speaker. I just want to point out, inshallah, we have 3 more speakers. We have 30 minutes, inshallah, and we do hope to have a Q&A. So we'll take as long as we need, inshallah. We have such a wealth of expertise here, and we do want to hear them all out, inshallah. But let's also see if we can have some time for a Q&A. We've got comments buzzing on Facebook, inshallah. I thank every speaker who has stayed on with us, with the most grateful. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah reward you with better. We will end the live stream there.